Welcome to Echoes of History. I'm Matt Lewis. Today I'm joined by historian and video game writer Holly Nielsen. Hi Holly.
Hi Matt. So together we'll be stepping into the Animus to uncover how history and gaming interact in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And later in the episode, I'll be speaking to Ben Hall, world director for Assassin's Creed Odyssey, about how the developers met with the challenge of recreating the people, the myths, and the places of the past.
World director sounds very cool. Assassin's Creed Odyssey takes us back in time to 431 BCE. We're in ancient Greece, inhabiting the memories of a Spartan warrior. Through them, we tread the ancient pathways and sail the Mediterranean seas around the Peloponnese, where the states of Athens and Sparta battle for supremacy. So Holly, I guess my first question is, as someone who has spent part of their career reviewing video games, what do you make of Odyssey?
So Odyssey was actually one of the last games I reviewed when I was doing reviews for The Guardian before I went and moved more into the academic and development side. So I have a real soft spot for it because it was a real kind of signing off point of that part of my career. But I really enjoyed it. It was a big departure for the series. It's much more of like an action RPG than a role-playing game, then potentially kind of more classic stealth game, which I know caused a little bit of drama. But it was really well received. And I think I gave it a pretty good review. It was just an incredibly impressive game, just ridiculously huge in all senses of the words, you know, the story, the map, the setting, it was all, you know, an odyssey in all senses of the word. And no, I loved it. And also Cassandra is one of my favorite characters in the whole series. So an excuse to go back to the game and spend more time with her, I'll take it.
We've worked our way through this cycle of Odyssey episodes, and listeners will have been introduced to Hippocrates. So a lot like Victoria in the Syndicate world, we've got a real name, a known character, a real person. I might be doing air quotes around real from what we heard about Hippocrates. He does seem to have been like a bucket figure that lots of people's different achievements were all put into so that he could be labelled as this father of medicine. And I guess that semi-legendary element gives game makers something to play with because we know a bit about him. He is real, but we don't know exactly what he did.
It's a really interesting one. So in historical fiction in general, in games, but also in TV and films and all of that, we often have these kind of totemic figures. And it's because in storytelling, you might be, okay, well, we want to show this group of people, or we want to show this idea or this movement, but showing that in a narrative is very difficult. So you're like, okay, this character represents this broader thing. This character may or may not have existed, or they're a kind of a receptacle for all this other stuff, but we want to show it and we're going to do it via this character. And, you know, that's a pretty standard way of, you know, that's a pretty common thing to find in historical fiction. And it's really interesting in this because it's already kind of been done for the game makers when it comes to ancient Greece, because as you said, you have centuries, if not millennia, of historiography and of how people are understanding stuff, and of, you know, people reading Plato at school and then going back and thinking, oh, well, actually, maybe Hippocrates wasn't one person, it was a movement, or it was this idea, or it kind of evolves and become this thing. It's already kind of done for you. You know, this character is already a totemic figure. And so placing that within the world has potentially less problems because, you know, we can look at these single figures and can maybe find problems and go, well, you know, condensing this thing down to one character is, you know, cuts off all these corners and blah, blah, blah. If it's something that we know really well, or we know something, you know, a lot about. But actually in this case, the actual historiography of the time period and the methodology behind creating these characters, they meet up in a really satisfying way. They really make sense to the world you're recreating because of the sources we have for the time period. And so, yeah, that's a really, your episode with Helen was fantastic. And I was listening to it, thinking about, you know, when you're writing these things and thinking, oh, what a really nice bit of kind of synergy, I guess, between these two things.
Almost like ancient Greece has prepared Herodotus for a future computer game to serve the need.
It's like, you know, we kind of worry, you know, totemic figures really have their role in historical fiction, but, you know, they don't come without their problems. But then in this case, it's like, oh no, we have hundreds of years of them already being this thing and potentially, you know, not being a one person and being an idea or all these kind of more amorphous things. And so that's very satisfying.
Yeah, and I guess that maybe answers what was going to be my next question about why pick Hippocrates in particular. Why would they go after the father of medicine? But it sounds like because a lot of the packaging work, I'm not going to say anyone at Ubisoft was being lazy, but a lot of the packaging work was already done and widely accepted. That's the historical figure of Hippocrates that everybody accepts. So the work is done, but also he's packaged up, ready to go and serve the game purposes, serve that wider idea of encapsulating a whole movement. And you don't really have to tinker with his character.
I think ancient Greece in general is such a good setting for this, because if you think of the sources we have for this, we have things like Plato, we have plays and all of this. So it's already this blurring between fiction and what's real and timings is already kind of blurry. And so playing within that, you have a lot of space to play, and blurring that boundary is kind of almost part of how we approach this time period. And so it just works really well. It works on multiple levels and it's very satisfying.
Yeah, and it particularly made me think about the chat we had about Victoria, and it's almost the opposite end of that challenge. In Victoria, you've got someone who is photographed, really well documented. We know a lot about her character. Anything that you mess with can be challenged. I guess that brings something in the sense of you don't have to do too much work because we know what she looks like and we know how she reacted in certain situations. But at the other end of that scale with Hippocrates, he could look like anything. He could behave in any which way that you like. So you have the freedom, but none of maybe the guides that you would have had with Victoria. So I guess both present their own challenges.
Yeah, you kind of have this idea of, okay, who is Hippocrates to us? What purpose is he serving in this world, in this narrative, as well as, because as Helen said in your podcast so well, that, Hippocrates is this figure where throughout the centuries, he has been multiple things. He's been whatever you want your ideal doctor to be at that time.
And then, we moved on then to the Olympics to think about the kind of the origins of the Olympics. And it's another moment the Olympics appear as something you can take part in Odyssey. And I guess, again, that idea of something that is testing your strength, your speed, your ability fits really nicely with a video game.
The history of the Olympics in video games could probably be a series in and of itself. Some of the earliest video games are about competitive sport, lots of famous video games about it. And so it is it's almost kind of as a medium, a kind of almost referential moment of like, it just works really well because, okay, here's the things you have to do. And here are the, mini games and, your physicality is such a huge part of this game. So it blends really nicely. And so, yeah, it's a really nice moment in that for me, at least, it's kind of referential to both the medium, the history of the medium itself, as well as the, the real history of the Olympics.
Yeah. And I'm someone who broke many joysticks playing Daley Thompson's Decathlon on the Commodore 64 and the Commodore Amiga. So
exactly,
I'm down with the Olympics in video games. But in an Assassin's Creed setting, I guess it's a little side quest, but the Olympics is set up for like a mini game scenario, isn't it? You can take part in all of these various little things and you have a good reason to be doing them. They're not just some random challenge that you've encountered.
Yeah, it's ideal, really, where it's like, rather than, because usually you're thinking like, okay, right, how am I going to justify these things? You go, great, got it. It's right there. It's the Olympics. You know what it means. You know what's involved. Obviously, there's some kind of license being taken in the fact that if you're playing as Cassandra, you can take part in the, the physical kind of ones, which she probably wouldn't have been able to. It's not my huge area of expertise. I'm a Victorianist, so this is, outside of my own expertise. But I remember it was a game when I first played it where it was the one in the series, because you pick between Cassandra and Alexios at the beginning. And as far as I'm aware, their script is very similar. I don't want to say identical, but very, very close. And I remember at the time thinking, oh, that's, interesting, because is it kind of ignoring gender history and the kind of potential of exploring this? But then on the other hand, I was like, do I want to play that? Do I want to play a game where, Cassandra's clambering over the buildings and then gets into Athens and she's told, well, you're not a citizen, go, it's a kind of, it's this power fantasy in terms of, society and culture. And it can be both those things. It can be a liberating power fantasy, and it can also be not engaging with gender history. And I think this was the game in the series that made me kind of sit with that and go, Okay, it can be both. And I can sit with that and I can be fine with that.
Yeah, I can't imagine many gamers, particularly female gamers, want to play a game where you're crushed down and denied everything by the patriarchy.
Yeah, I mean, there's a game there. Whether it's this series is a different matter. I think it's a difficult one.
It's moments like that that, I'm starting to see the decisions. Talking to you is making me want to see those decisions that people are making, because we talked about Victorian children in the factories. That is referenced, but maybe not all of the questions are answered. It's almost like they've stepped away from even engaging with the gender issues here at all, just to allow the freedom of the gameplay. So I guess there's always a juxtaposition, a scale going on. To give more of one thing, you need to take something else away. And it's finding the balance. And that balance might be different for different issues in different games, in different settings.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, these aren't peer-reviewed papers. These aren't academic books. These are entertainment products. They're media, they're historical fiction, and a lot of research and a lot of work goes into them into the setting and into the characters. But also you have to take into consideration, accessibility and enjoyment, and a player being able to locate themselves within a 3D environment. There's all these things you have to take into consideration that don't necessarily match up with if you were writing a peer-reviewed paper. Also because even just picking certain things of history, they have to kind of put their pin in what they want to show, and that automatically then excludes other interpretations of history. That's the way it is when you're recreating something, but that's okay because that is the thing they're creating. And so it's understanding that, but then understanding the decisions behind that, I think, is very interesting.
Yeah. And I guess as well, it's a game set in ancient Greece, but the Olympics gives it a really modern resonance to it. It's an ancient thing, but something that is happening. I mean, I nearly said still happening. Obviously, it hasn't been happening continuously. But the modern Olympics is something that everyone will know and understand today. So there you're able to. How important is it in those moments to connect the player today to something that is recognizable? Hippocrates is a name that they will recognize, even if they're not sure quite what he did. But the Olympics is something that almost everybody will know stuff about.
It's an interesting one because it's an immediate kind of grounding for the player. It's an immediate kind of recognizable moment of, okay, I know what this is. You don't need to explain this huge backstory. Got it. Olympics, know where I am, know what I'm doing. And there will be variations of that. I go, oh, I didn't realize that was a thing that happened, or there are these moments for kind of ideas being questioned and things like that. But it's a thing that the player can locate themselves within fairly easily without needing a lot of hand holding, which is always great because hand holding is frustrating sometimes, especially in an open world game. You want players to be able to get in quickly and know what's going on and without a lot of exposition. So stuff like that, wonderful. Immediately what it is. Yeah, it's an interesting one because also I think there's also maybe presumptions that are sometimes tackled of these things. Same with Hippocrates, especially with ancient Greek culture and the world. There's these big figures and big events that have been repurposed into our modern society to mean something or to represent something that maybe is not what they would have meant in the past, or it says more about us now than it does about that society. And I think it's okay to embrace that. Yes, there's kind of questionings and things like that, but also I think it's important to recognize that we're creating a game of here and now. And so, yes, we have Hippocrates in there because this is the character that we recognize. Yes, we have the Olympics because this is a thing we have now. And that's okay that they are reflections upon the time that's created, because I don't know, I just find that interesting because I think ancient Greece in particular is something that's called upon within our modern society to make understandings of what's happening now. And so, yeah, I think it's great for a game to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it feels an awful lot like Odyssey and Ancient Greek really hits a sweet spot with things that you can engage with and play, and there is a bit of freedom that it's beyond really well documented history, but it's also recognizable. You don't, like you say, you don't have to do too much exposition and explain what the Olympics are too much because everybody knows what the Olympics are. The other episode that we've covered is on kind of the Parthenon and also the pantheon of Greek gods who were around. And it struck me that maybe this kind of time of mythology, a period in which people believed in a raft of gods that we don't believe in today, must give game creators a good degree of freedom because they can play with that. People who were in ancient Greece believed those gods were real and that they intervened in the world. So you can legitimately show that even though we would say we don't believe that Zeus came down and started getting women pregnant all the time.
For game makers, I mean, there's been a huge number of really big successful games that have used the kind of Greek gods as these kind of figures, because again, it's ones where people sort of know what you're dealing with. You're dealing with, Zeus has lightning bolts and gets angry. Athena is wise. You have these, these kind of ready-made archetypes to play with, and they're very strong both character-wise and also aesthetically. So they're kind of recognizable, but also, yeah, as you say, it gives you a lot of room to play with them. And so they're really popular within historical fiction, within historical video games, I think because of that reason, because a lot of people, they're recognizable, they're dramatic, all their stuff is it's emotional, it's human drama to the highest point, it's theater, it's all these kind of classic stories that we've heard and told in all sorts of different ways. And so yeah, it's a brilliant blending of both recognizable and then also space to create new things with. So I think the Greek gods and the kind of blurring of kind of myth and things like that, they're really popular because they're very human for gods. As I say, they're emotional, they're all of this. And so Greek gods are having a real moment at the moment, I think. They have been for a little while because of that, because they're both us and not us, and reflective, and also reflective of the worst and the best of humanity. And so they give writers a lot of room to explore that.
I asked Tristan who his favourite Greek god was, and he was like, well, none of them, they're all horrible.
They're all awful. Yeah. They're all, yeah, they are. If you look at the stuff, you're like, oh God, this is,
Yeah. And with the Parthenon as well. So we talked about the Parthenon, which is a building you can walk into, but climb as well in Odyssey. And I'm always interested in how, and maybe this is something Ben might want to talk about, but how do you recreate such an iconic building? People can go to the Parthenon today, and I always think it's interesting when you've played an assassin. I've never been to the Parthenon, full disclosure, but to go somewhere that you've played it in a game and you've climbed all over it, and then to go and see what's left 2,500 years after it was at its peak, or even the other way around, to go and see the ruins and then to see it presented in a game in its full splendor. There must be some challenges, but also some pleasure to bringing buildings like that really back to life.
I think there's a real power to these things, particularly, and then, as you said, you can scramble across this building, you can climb across it. I don't recommend I've never been to the Parthenon, but I'm going to imagine they don't let you do that in real life. And so, but there's a kind of tactility that can come with video games that you perhaps can't, for very good reason, do in real life, both if you're recreating the ruins, or if you're giving these buildings, imagining what they would have been at their kind of most splendid. And so I think there is something very powerful to that in terms of connecting people to the past or engaging people with the past, because it's something that you can do in the digital that you can't do in the physical, unless you wanted to recreate the Parthenon and let everyone climb over it, which I'm going to say is not impossible, but is potentially has its difficulties. It also means that people can explore these things without having, they're not limited by their geography. You can be, if you have, video games have access problems for other reasons in terms of hardware and software and pricing and all of that. But if you do have access to it, no matter where you are in the world, you can clamber over the Parthenon, which is pretty great, because I've never been to the Parthenon. I would love to. You haven't either. But it means kind of geography-wise, it takes that element out of it. And of course, it's never going to be able to fully recreate actually going physically to somewhere, but it can really help engage people with these kind of structures. I think are very powerful for that.
I would probably ask Ben, how much thought goes into the detail that is on the walls of somewhere like the Parthenon. That's probably a really rude question, because what I'm essentially saying is, do you do your job properly, Ben, or do you just make it up? What I was actually trying to get at, if I was trying to structure that properly and not be appearing to be rude to Ben, is that there are things we know. Mm-hmm. We have the Parthenon friezes, we have some detail, and there are things we don't know. So there must be bits of the Parthenon that you can recreate from what we have, and bits that will be gaps that have to be filled in, that must require some subjective artistic interpretation of what was probably there.
I mean, there's a long history of artists recreating historical buildings. This isn't there's this has been going on for decades, if not centuries, of people doing imaginings of we take the bits that we know and we kind of fill in the gaps and things like that. And so they're kind of part of this very long lineage of lots of people doing that. They have to do it within a 3D environment, which I think adds something. That's something I can never quite get my head around as someone who has no artistic ability whatsoever. It's always incredibly impressive to me. I'm very curious to hear if artists did on-site visits and how even just the practicality of like measurements and things of like getting the scale right and things like that. I think is because scale is difficult in a 3D video game because you can't actually have things as far away as they actually work. So it would take you ages to get anywhere, and that's not a very fun video game. But then when you're clambering up buildings, if Parthenon feels really small, it's going to feel really small. And so balancing that, I'm really curious to hear about, because that seems very difficult to do. And I mean, beyond the realms of anything that I could possibly think of. So yeah, very interested to hear about that.
Yeah, definitely. Wonderful. I have thoroughly enjoyed my time in ancient Greece going around Odyssey, and it's been fantastic to try and pick your brains a little bit about why they may have made some of those decisions. And it'd be fascinating to hear what Ben has to say about how you bring that epic ancient world really to life in an artistic sense on the screen for the player. So thank you very much, Holly. And I hope you enjoy your chat with Ben.
Oh, thank you so much, Matt. And we are joined by Benjamin Hall, who was World Director on Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Thank you so much for joining us, Benjamin.
Thank you for having me.
So I think we better start with, what does a World Director do?
It's a great question. I think the World Director role is something that's sometimes different on different projects. So the role is actually quite changeable depending on the needs of the different games that we're making. So on Assassin's Creed Odyssey, my role as World Director was really to be responsible for the creation of the playground. We often call it the playground. We're making a game, so we want to make it fun and playful. So working with a multidisciplinary team of artists and level designers and a load of other people, technical people involved as well, our job was to build from the ground up what we wanted to create as a representation of Greece and the ancient Greek world that we wanted to let players explore and play around in.
So one of the things that really struck me when I first reviewed it all those years ago was just the scale of the game. It is an enormous game, So I just wanted to ask what it was like creating that scale, creating this huge map. Both it's vertical, it's deep, it's got all sorts going on. So I'd love to know about that.
Yeah, one of the goals we set out with was to make a rich and diverse world. And really from the off, the decision to go with that concept of going on an Odyssey was really something we all wanted to tap into in all disciplines making the game. So from a world perspective, really, it was about making sure we could create a space that was fun to explore, that allowed people to have that sensation of adventure, not quite knowing what's across the next ridge and having that journey of wonder and awe that I think people would have had when traveling through ancient Greece. But at the same time, like you say, making sure it wasn't fatiguing to get around. So when it came to thinking about how we were going to create spaces, there was a concept of honeycombs that I wanted to play with. So each of the different regions was somewhat walled in by the terrain around it, which actually is represented with the landscape of ancient Greece and how the different city-states were actually spread across the countryside. And then with the height, the verticality, it's a very, very mountainous landscape. So making sure we could achieve that sensation. But at the same time, if players wanted to climb to the top of Mount Tegetus, they could go, and it wasn't going to take them 3 days to get there. It was actually something they could achieve and then give them some kind of reward when they got to the top.
I think it was really impressive. Just there's all sorts of different cultures going on. And so, yeah, that kind of honeycomb idea is really interesting. And I think the kind of scale in particular, it can't be one-to-one, as you say, players don't want to spend actually 3 days climbing a mountain. I mean, maybe some do, but that's a different game. So yeah, just how do you balance that idea of kind of keeping the scale of certain buildings and architecture and then also working within, a real map, a real geography?
To begin with, one of the things that was really important for me was making sure that when you open the map for the game, the landscape from above represented what people expect or imagine when they think about Greece. If they go to Google Earth and they see there's the very distinct layout of the country, it's quite a unique layout with we called it the hand of the Peloponnese, and then you've got the peninsula of Attica was something that was going to be super important, and then the trident of Macedonia up in the top are all things that pop out. Then with the islands distributed to the Aegean, it gives a sort of a balance and a contrast between what we called the mainland and the islands. So we started started with that. Started out with whiteboards, drawing things, getting maps, getting asked to clear acetate, changing things, making iterations, taking pictures, putting that into Photoshop, tweaking, changing. So the iterative process is always part of making video games, and we really wanted to go with that early on. So it was fast, it was furious. We continued to develop how that landscape was going to feel as we played it. And then we'd start to think about the layering in of the different aspects, so the different city-states, and we started to learn. And it felt like going back to college, learning about ancient Greece and having specialists come and work with us to teach us and bring things to the game. Then we went to Greece. So then a few of us were lucky enough to actually travel to Greece and go and look around the landscape. And I'd been, as a youngster, I'd been to the Greek islands, but never to the mainland. So going to the mainland was a new experience. So to actually stand, in Sparta and look at the landscape and kind of imagine back to how people must have felt, and the scale of the land really gave you that sensation that you can imagine why the concept of the gods was something that they really thought about. And our audio director was there just as a thunderstorm rolled through, and she managed to capture a thunderstorm. And as it bounces off all the mountainsides, it really reverberates and creates a sensation of power. So that kind of changed a little bit, the feeling. So when we came back from that trip, it was about how do we capture then that sense of scale, the mountains especially, but again, keep this world a playable space. So it was very much about removing certain things, and then there were certain landmarks that started to gain importance from a historical perspective as we learned that we're like, these are going to become anchor points. And these anchor points were then things that I became somewhat stoically keen on making sure we tried to accurately portray. We didn't get too carried away with how we were going to play with them and let people go too wild with them, because I wanted them to recapture that feeling of what it felt like to stand there. So places like Olympia, for example, it was one of the anchor points when we were in Sparta. Athens obviously became one of them. But then as we started to move and shift the landscape around, we came up with against other problems, like how do we fit Athens into this, and how do we recapture the sensation of being in Athens and the Parthenon and the Acropolis and give players that sensation. So there was very much an ebb and a flow to, we put something in, we shift the landscape, we tweak, we change, we modify, and then we move on, and we worked our way around the world with that same mindset. And a lot of it was to do with mapping. A world guy obsessed with maps. I remember speaking to Canadian Geographic about maps at one point. And we started early off with this concept of layering into each of the different city-states, the different regions of the world, what it was about them that was different. And you talked a little bit about how making it non-homogeneous. So that was our tool really for that, was looking into what each of these places was famous for, or what came out of the research that was something that we could highlight and underline, and then letting the world builders use that and build upon that and tell stories with that and start to build crowd life in that would represent what they were doing. So Arcadia, for example, was always named the breadbasket of the Peloponnese. So we used that as the tool in which we could tell stories. So lots of farmlands, lots of agriculture, lots of farmers, and those people showcasing that lifestyle when it comes to the world building level.
It's so fascinating to hear about, this iterative process and the order of things, because you have, particularly in Assassin's Creed games, you have these real kind of symbolic kind of like, you have the Parthenon and you have these really, and it's fascinating to hear that you don't necessarily start with that. That's just really interesting. It's really interesting to hear. And also I'm kind of, this question might be too specific, but I know when I'm playing, one of the things that really interests me is the kind of in-between spaces, when you're leaving Athens and going into another area, and how you create those areas to feel kind of natural and feel like there's a flow. So you have this difference, but it doesn't feel like, right, I'm leaving here and now I've entered this space. It's really interesting.
I think that really came down to one of the concepts of the Greek world at the time. And the way we think about Greece is as one homogeneous country, because that's how we're used to it today. And at the time, it was actually split into these different city-states. And the different states had different types of leadership, different types of, like I already said, different trade, different things that they were famous for. So that was all part of that process about how we do that transition as you journey. So the journey for me was also as important as making sure that we got Athens right, or we got Delphi right, was to make sure that players could have that ability to go on that journey. And as you wend your way through the pathways, there was different things that were popping up and cropping up to give you that sense of travel and that movement throughout the landscape, because that's really part of the Odyssey we wanted to create. And for those areas, we really, again, tried to tap into research. So we had a researcher working with us. It was phenomenal. She went super deep into loads of research and would come with ideas, and that allowed us then to pick and choose between different interesting kind of bits that we could pop up and populate the world with. So a lot of the mythical layer of there's the tree of Medusa in there, for example, that we put in. There's actually a real researched connection to that area of the world and that type of historical context. It may have just been a stele back in the past that somebody found, and we turned it into something far more elaborate to allow players to have the sensation of awe and wonder as they travel, but then also to give them what we call POIs, points of interest, a location centric, so they can remember, oh, I passed the tree of Medusa back there, so therefore I must be heading in this direction, or I'm in this region. And again, that helps create that sensation of diversity and variety as people are traveling throughout the landscape.
And you really do feel that in the game, kind of I really enjoyed it because as you say, the kind of journey was just as enjoyable as the actual destination. You kind of really feel that effort that went in. And I'm interested in the kind of this. So was the research with you from the very beginning?
Almost. So we did some of the early versions of the maps. We did where it was just us on the team, and we were just kind of figuring things out for ourselves, watching documentaries, reading Wikipedia, which a lot of it we can learn later is not actually all that accurate. So then once we'd been out on the research trip, it was actually some of the historians that were with us on the research trip were then people that joined us on the team, and then really started to become important members of what we were doing, because we needed to make sure there was this level of authenticity. I think we always went with the concept of authenticity. It's not accurate. It can never be. We're not making a one-for-one representation. We're not rebuilding ancient sites with a sense of, archaeological reference. It's still a game. We still want to make them fun. But by making them connected to that authenticity, we could make people feel like it was something that was real. It feels more grounded when it's got that layer to it. So they really helped us make sure that those things were done properly.
I think one of the things that really lends to the authenticity are the details. They're kind of really small. I know when I was playing, I got distracted by watching NPCs gather honey from kind of these long clay things. And I just caught myself. I was like, oh, I've spent ages just watching this. And it made me think of, where do you draw the line when it comes to details? Because I can imagine you could drive yourself and the team crazy by going, okay, no, this needs to be. So how do you choose what to include and what you think, okay, no, we have to draw a line at some point?
It could be really difficult finding that line, and I think that's part of the process we go through. We obviously we want to put everything in there, and then at some point we've got a team and we've got a certain number of hours per week, and we get producers that say, hey, you've got to make a decision about this or about this. But I think from the very beginning, that concept of layering, I talked about the way we looked at the maps and we looked at the different things that were out there, really helped us start to be able to create some focus points. So when it came to people's jobs, the marble creation, we created a whole flow through the Piraeus and up into Athens, where we were showcasing that process of how marble came in on the ships, how it was then used by people and sculpted into different objects. So we showed through stories, and we try to tell stories in the landscape so that people can see it and hopefully do what you did, which is kind of get lost in it and be like, oh, I'll follow you for a little while. I think that was an amazing part about the technology that we had as well, that every single NPC in the world actually has an agenda. They have things that they need. They have things that they want to do. So they will sleep at night. They'll get up. They'll go get food. Then they'll go to work. And as they're at work, there's different things that they will do during that time at work. So I remember at one point we were showcasing the game. We were in the Piraeus, and we kind of practiced to make sure that we could showcase these different sections. And for some reason, I think somebody asked a question, so the timing was slightly off. And when we got to one of the places, everyone had gone for lunch. It's like, there's nobody here because they've all gone for lunch. But the great thing is I could walk down to the tavern, and there they were. They were sat eating the lunch at the tavern, and then lunch finished, and they all went back to work. And it really helps create a world that feels like it's alive without any of the stories from the game, without doing missions, without running around swords out fighting people. You can wander around the world and you can see it being alive. And I think that really makes a great backdrop for a video game.
No, it really, really does. And in this game in particular, one of the really striking things is obviously set during the Peloponnesian Wars, and being able to actually decide certain outcomes and have an influence. I'm really interested to hear about, the decisions behind this inclusion, and particularly with things like, player agency in mind and all of that. It was another point where I was like, the scale of this game, again, not just in terms of the map, but in terms of, mechanics and all of that. Yeah, really, really interesting. You have this huge macro historical event and the player is partaking.
Yeah, I think that was a decision made really early on by the creative team, so by Joe and Scott, to set the game during that period. So it's over a period of years, and by doing so, it meant that we could utilize all those different things that happened. It's a period in history that's relatively well known. It's something that, especially in North America, a lot of high schools will learn about. So there was things already there in people's minds, in people's zeitgeist, that we could tap into. And then putting the player in this role of a mystios, like a nobody, almost like a mercenary that sits in between. There's just muscle that can get involved with things. Put that agency into the player's hands, so the agency, the relatedness, and the competency really comes out in the play style of the game. Letting the player manipulate the world, toy with the world, and have an impact on the world was really something that was important from the off. And I think that's what makes a game experience, is when the player can actually have an impact, and you can see that impact play out on the landscape. So being able to actually wander off into the world, not even start any of the quests, you can go and start to play around with these different regions and change a city-state from Athenian to Spartan if you want to. But then this whole thing is live and it's running by itself. So you could go around and do a few regions and turn them from Athenian to Spartan. But when you go off somewhere else, those places are still having conflict in the background. There's a simulation running, and I think that was, again, another layer that made the world feel realistic is, that state's changed back again because this war's carrying on and it's ongoing. So that really gave us the opportunity within the world to, again, it's about showcasing authenticity, but making sure that there's a playable toy, there's something the players can interact with and manipulate and change. And I think those two combined really, really well in the Peloponnesian War.
That's really interesting, because I think sometimes games can struggle a bit with settings seeming very static. It kind of feels like a snapshot. And I think having the player interact in that way kind of highlights the fluidity of the time period and just, this kind of constant political, military kind of churning that's happening. Really interesting. So one thing that I was really fascinated by is the kind of blurring of myth and history. The series has always kind of done that, but I feel like it got to Odyssey and it just really, blew up. And I think the game does it very playfully. It has a a real sense of fun with it, but it kind of highlights some real poignant things about history and the kind of, what can get lost, what gets misunderstood, and how time kind of, changes our perspective on things. That history is this kind of written, human created, constantly changing thing. And so the game itself has, it has examples of, so I guess kind of mythical creatures, examples, I think the Cyclops very early on turns out just to be a guy with an eye missing. And I think there's another one later on. But then there are also real mythological beings in it. And so I'm curious as to how you find that balance and kind of what was the decision process between, okay, we're going to lean into this.
Yeah, I think narratively it was always something from the off, was the team created a pyramid, and the pyramid was about how different aspects of narrative were going to layer into the game, and having some levity in there was certainly something. It's a very serious thing to talk about. It's historical. We know that people are very, very passionate about making sure things like this are represented correctly. But at the same time, the notion of stories that we see in here today was something that we could resonate through what was happening within the world. So the idea of somebody that went fishing at the weekend and they come back and they say, I caught a fish and it was this big, was kind of the background to, well, what if that's how some of these stories came about? So like when we put in the Nemean lion, for example, it was like, well, okay, we're putting that in there, and it's got this link back to mythological stories that we've seen written, but we still consider to this day to be story and mythology. But then knowing that at that time, people didn't really travel around the world that much. It was dangerous. So, going outside of the city-state was not something a lot of people did. So I think the people that did move from place to place either needed to for a very specific reason. Typically, they'd probably done something bad, or they were very, very adventurous. So I think using that and then allowing them to move these stories around the world, and then as the stories as they travel around the world, they probably get bigger and bigger and more elaborate, was something that we tapped into to be able to create these big, bodacious creatures. But then on the flip side, be able to, I don't want to say mock it because it sounds disrespectful, but show it from a different perspective and how it could have come about, or how different people might have originated some of those stories and then had them grow into something else. And then I think the fusion of the two was really interesting, and I think Assassin's Creed is a great setting for us to be able to do that. Being in the Animus means that we're inside this simulation of a historical authenticity, which again gives us a few excuses to kind of explain away some bits and pieces. And for the majority of the actual mythical fights, where you see what you see as a representation of a real mythical creature, would quite often fuse in artistic direction, would fuse in some elements of the Isu. So there's bits in there to make people question, as a player looking through Cassandra or Alexios at the world that they're seeing in front of them, is what I'm seeing a Animus recreation through the layer of the Isu to me through my DNA, or is it the game or the world saying these things actually existed? And by putting that in a question mark bubble really allowed us to be able to put those things in and again have the playability. We're a game, we want to have fun, and people expect like, oh, ancient Greece, I'm going to see a Cyclops and we're going to fight. So it was really a great way of being able to fuse those things into the world and make them make a semblance of sense.
I think it's also fitting as well, because I think, you know, historical stuff can sometimes get a little bit po-faced when actually, when you look at the kind of sources at the time, you know, we have comedy during this time period, we have plays, and it is kind of playing with the sense of humor and the little bits of silliness, I think is really fun, because that's there within the text, that's there within the archaeology. And so it's kind of sometimes, I think, sometimes people have a habit of kind of projecting our own kind of ideas of, oh no, well, it's very serious because it happened a long time ago. And actually, you know, no, comedy was there, sense of humor was there. I really love the character of the captain of your ship, kind of replaying
Barnabas.
the game. Oh, Barnabas, yes, he is wonderful, because there's a whole quest about trying to find, and he says all these fantastical tales, and then you find kind of, okay, sort of Barnabas, but sort of not, and then you've got Herodotus on the ship with you, kind of, and I think the inclusion of Herodotus in particular, I found, you know, really fascinating. You've kind of got, you know, the quote-unquote Fabre of, you know, Western history, that idea, and it really, you know, he's kind of documenting your exploits, and I think that is kind of a fun statement in and of itself. It's a kind of fun playing with history.
Well, it kind of represents the sort of the self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think Herodotus was a big focus for us when we were doing research, because of the fact he had that fusion of what is considered to be historical fact, but also he would talk about the mythological stories. And I think having him be with you documenting what you're doing kind of explains, or could explain, if it was real, how he ended up documenting what he did document in what we consider reality. So then they start to loop around each other, and then the relationship between him and Barnabas on the ship, especially as you're traveling around the world, they become kind of your mom and dad almost. You get kind of get both sides of the story from the two of them, and it makes a really great relationship.
No, it's a really wonderful dynamic. I thought it was really interesting, the idea of kind of perhaps us trying to separate, you know, myth from fact is actually a bit ahistorical of us for a time period where it is much more intertwined than perhaps we would see it. And so I think playing with that, you know, and was there a sense of going back to this more ancient setting? Did you feel a sense of a bit more freedom perhaps, or was it just different?
I think I'd say different. I think freedom we needed to be very careful with, because a lot of people are very, very passionate about this time period and have very strong views. And it's one of the things with history is the playground for Assassin's Creed. But at the same time, we have to be careful, because this is a culture. It's a people's culture. It's a people's history. And no matter where we are in the world, when we're looking at using that to create a piece of entertainment, we need to be respectful, and we need to make sure that we don't kind of break that trust. So there's an element of freedom just because it's so old, but there's so much to tap into. The amount of research and history that we were getting and going through that to make decisions on picking things out, it was both liberating and constraining at the same time. So the balance that we struck really was that, as mentioned already, that concept of authenticity really became important. And then there were certain places in the world where I was more strict with the team, saying, no, this is something that I really want to make sure we get this right, because otherwise, we are going to put this out there and we're going to get questioned as to why we didn't do our research properly, and we did, or why we made certain decisions. So places like Olympia, Delphi, Athens in particular, Corinth, places like that, we really wanted to make sure that they were put together in a way that when people were able to explore them, it could be something, like I said, it's something fun. There's lots of stories there to learn about. There's lots of interesting things happening in the world that makes it feel alive and makes it feel impacted by this ongoing Peloponnesian War. But also it has that layer of historical authenticity that means people are taking something away from the game more than just, I can run around with swords and murder Spartans.
I want to just talk a bit about the kind of, I guess, aesthetics of the game, because it's a really visually, striking game. The setting itself is so appealing, so iconic. And one thing that really struck me was, you have occasionally these statues and temples and stuff that are really decadently painted, which, we, archaeologically, archaeologists and historians know that they were, but we don't have, we don't have a lot to go off, other than, this probably existed. So I'm wondering, how did the artists, how did they recreate these things that we perhaps don't know what they look like?
It's a challenge for sure, because it creates an opportunity for going down a path that leads us somewhere that's not totally accurate. I think from the very off, working with Thierry at Dancer, the art director, one of the key goals was to make sure that we didn't fall into the trap of the Hollywood depiction of ancient Greece, the just plain white marble and everything, but maybe a few elements of gold here and there, which is typically how it's been depicted in the past. So quite early on, research started to showcase the fact that there was a lot more going on. It was a lot more colorful. There were a lot more things that had been dyed and processes that were in place for fabrics and for wall art and for paint. And we wanted to showcase that. And we wanted to make sure that people had, again, that almost teaching, but without preaching. So making sure that the world became this beautiful space to explore. And people were like, wow, okay, I didn't realize that that's how the inside of these places were painted. And some of it comes down to the research. So there was, again, a lot of research done to tap into and understand what was used and how it was used. For example, we learned that the color purple was incredibly expensive at the time because it was really, really hard to create dyes. So we've got a whole island that's pretty much dedicated to the process of creating the purple dye from the fish that were in the ocean. But that process was there, that storyline was there to explain why purple was used in the way it was used at the time. So there were some places where we pushed boundaries when it came to some of the elaborate dressings, when it came to the way we put banners on buildings and things like that. This was a gamification. It was pushing the limits of what we believe to be the way it was done, but it helps players in terms of understanding, okay, this city-state's now patrolled by the Athenians because I can see the blue banners everywhere. And there's things that we did like that to push player understanding of what's happening in the game that they're playing, on top of that layer of history. But it was always about trying to create against that layer of authenticity. And then we had an amazing art team that really wanted to make the game as beautiful as possible. So the architecture team in particular, we were looking at all the different ways we could showcase these different varieties of life, different ways in which things were built, and also the different layers of history. So we wanted to make sure that the world wasn't just a snapshot of how people imagined it would have been during the Peloponnesian War, because we know that there was a history before that time. So making sure that we had the Mycenaean history and the Minoan history in there as well gave us that extra ability to create more depth and more layers in our landscape, but also to showcase the different types of architectural styles and building methods that we used at the time to build the world out.
It's one thing I really appreciated was, again, sometimes I think with historical settings, or at least just game settings that are kind of using history in certain ways, is there can be a flattening of history, especially if there's like a big event. It kind of becomes, well, there's the before and there's the after. And I think sometimes with the Peloponnesian War, there was a risk of being like, okay, well, we have the during and then there's just everything that happened before. But actually there's a real sense because, you have the kind of Bronze Age stuff, you have the temples, you have a much more layered stuff, which is something I would love to see brought to games more in general, because I think history is really wonderful for showing that how to avoid this flattening, so I think, it really shows in the game.
Cool. Well, it's good that it's come out. It's definitely something we aimed for. It really helps create that element of depth. And again, it's about making a world that feels like it's alive, and it's not real, but it's a place you can get lost in, and it's a place that you can adventure through. And it all comes back to that key concept of making an odyssey for the player to be able to go on their own odyssey. So being able to tap into those things really helped us build that space to create that emotion.
So we've spoken a little bit about the kind of myth and inclusion of myth. And with the DLC, it kind of particularly goes hard in that you have Atlantis, you have, kind of gods and things like that. And so I was really curious about, yes, I ended up down a rabbit hole because I played the games, but I had to learn about the issue, and I was reading, and I've ended up down, imagine the kind of corkboard of strings all around as I'm trying to, figure out what's going on. I can't imagine, trying to get head around that. And so, I was kind of wondering, how do you balance the myths of the game, the series itself, with the myths of the setting?
Mixing the two together, the two myths is often a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. So for us in particular, when it came to mainland Greece, which is where I spent more of my effort working on the main opus of the game, we still had the inclusion of the Isu, and we, with the Gates of Atlantis and the journey down and that journey into that space, making sure that players have a clear understanding that this is not now no longer a depiction of ancient Greece was what was important to me. So making sure that the spaces that we created felt distinctly different. So as a brand, there's a whole lore around the Isu, there's a whole history. So in some ways, you've got to kind of learn about that too. You go to school to learn about ancient Greece, but then you've got to learn about these aspects as well to make sure that everything that we do in the game still fits with that history. And this is a fictional history, but it's still a history that we want to maintain. We want to make sure we stay accurate and we don't break things. So we had to learn about all those different aspects and then build upon different elements from past games to bring that forward into Odyssey. So when it came to those spaces, we wanted to make sure that they felt, like I said, distinctly different. So by using a very, very different style of architecture, by infusing elements of even more kind of mythical, almost sci-fi elements into the rock, we had all the different like little beads of color that would glow and ebb and gave this sensation of this is very, very different to what I'm experiencing elsewhere in the world. That was really where we concentrated on making those differentiations stand out. And then when you do go down to the Gates of Atlantis, there's then these almost holographic projections that kick off, and it really gives you that sensation, wait a minute, this isn't something that took place in ancient Greece. So we could create that separation and allow players to understand that the fusion of the historical gods and the Isu gods then becomes a concept within the Animus itself, and that was really the vehicle that allowed that exploration into that space.
Yeah, I think kind of having that clear visual differentiation is really important, and it is very clear. You kind of realize, okay, I'm not in, it's kind of like, we're not in Kansas anymore, Toto type moment of like, okay, right, yep, this is different. And I should probably say for anybody listening to this who has no idea what we're talking about, the issue is the kind of, I guess the ancient technological society that a lot of the kind of assassins, it's the lore of Assassin's Creed, so it's about blending the real world history with what's going on in the games, which obviously is not real, but you can have a lot of fun with. But I am curious about recreating, you said there were certain places that you really wanted to get right, or you really wanted to feel as authentic as possible, things like the Parthenon and all of that. And I was wondering, how do you go about that in terms of like the very details, and in terms of like, do you have architectural plans? Do you send people, how does it work?
So in order to achieve the accuracy with those spaces that were really important to us, we really did dig deep. So we almost went to an archaeological level of research to be able to understand how these spaces were laid out. Thankfully, there's a lot of people, as I've said, that are very, very passionate about ancient Greece, and these spaces are also, places of historical interest in Greece. So we could go to some of them. So we went to Olympia, we went to Delphi, we went to Athens, and we spent time on those historical sites. We visited the museums, and we gathered a lot of information. And then on top of that, with the additional research from our historian coming in, we were able to start to build really comprehensive decks on how these things were laid out, how they were built, what they were painted with, what things looked like. There's always almost a trifecta to be made between that authentic accuracy, the fact we're making a game, so we've got other things that kick in at that point. We've got to make sure that all the places for climbing are accurate, that the player doesn't get stuck, doesn't get trapped, that there's enough movement space for fluid movement for the character. The fact that we learned that the big temples quite often were almost seen as banks, so we knew straight up, like, okay, these are going to be places of interest for the player. They're going to want to go there, which means we're then going to have to protect them. So then they needed to have the right amount of space for combat to take place. So all of these things, these metrics come into play as well at a point where we need to sometimes bend what we know to be true to be able to make sure that the game can play properly. Then the third aspect of that is the technology. We're running a real-time simulation of a game, so there's some decisions, sometimes some hard decisions we had to make about, okay, we'd really like to have that sculpture be 100% accurate, but we don't have the memory budget in this space. Specifically Athens, it's a big spot for us to build. We had a lot of people, a lot of buildings, a lot of diversity and variety. So it was core to make sure that we created the sensation of the city being right, the distance between, or the relationship between certain parts of the city, to make sure that felt right. Like the long walls, for example, we were never going to build 8 kilometers of long walls because it was A, going to be boring, and B, just make the world ridiculously big. So instead, we made the decision to go for, okay, we're going to create a representation of the long walls. We can explain to the player what they were there for, what function they served, what happened inside of the long walls, but not have to build the giant, massive 8 kilometers of walls. So there were some decisions we had to make at some points that were tough. But we tried to do our best, basically, to make the right decisions at the right points.
Yeah, because as you say, you're creating a video game. You're working within the hardware, the software that you have. You're playing this kind of curatorial role historically, but then also you're a game designer and a level designer. And so, I always think that when climbing over the buildings and stuff, I'm like, oh God, it's just the blending of kind of historical kind of architect and designer and also level design it's a difficult one to match.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that was part of our process when we went into building. It was, my team in particular was a fusion of level designers and artists. And then we had other teams that were satellite teams around us that we'd feed and would communicate with each other. So the biome team, for example, making all of the different plants and all the wonderful different rocks and pieces like that. And then together we'd work to make sure that we were going to place the biomes in different spaces. So we'd had these different looks that we were trying to capture to be able to represent Greece throughout a period of time. So we had a spring biome and a summer biome. We had the volcanic biome. We had the Paradise Islands biome. Then we had the more arid looking biomes too. So then making decisions on how we placed those different looks around the world became part of the rhythm of how we created that diversity. And then once we started to understand more about how the story was going to play out and the journey of that story was going to play out, again, it allowed us to infuse some differentiators between those different spaces, especially early on. So as you move from like the first island and then you go into the next region, we could change the overall visual palette and make sure it feels refreshed as you move around the world. And that was something that was really great as that started to solidify, being able to work with those different groups and build that rhythm and almost edit at the beginning of the game to make sure that it felt like you were going on this journey and things changed and there was things happening all of the time.
And I'm curious about the, you mentioned you worked with experts and historians and archaeologists. Did you have a kind of core group that were always there, or did you have a kind of lots of different experts to go, okay, well, this person is an expert in the ancient Olympics, or this person an expert? I'm curious as to how the expertise was managed, as it were.
Well, early on, there was a small group of historians that would bring different things to the table, and then we ended up with one historian, Stephanie Anarata, who became our historian, and she really became part of the team. So she would then work with the architecture team to talk and discuss about details that would be made. She worked really closely with the world team, especially when we're looking at all of those different elements of variety and distinction between the different city-states. Like, her information and research was critical to make sure we could build things with that layer of authenticity and make smart decisions on what we were going to put where. So we really, centralized around her research. And then we had other people that she would speak to different people, and she had her network of specialists that she could speak to and bring that information to us when we really needed something if she couldn't get the right information.
That's really interesting. Did you find having a kind of historian or an expert embedded, did you find that helpful in terms, well, obviously you found it helpful, it was incredibly helpful, but in terms of, do you prefer having a historian embedded in the process, do you think, now having experienced that?
I always would. Yeah, I think having somebody with that level of expertise and ability to research and find information and know who to speak to, know where to look, and it really adds a layer on top of what we would otherwise find if we were researching things for ourselves. So it's always been part of the Assassin's Creed mantra and the brand, is to have specialist people on the team that can help to make sure that we're doing things correctly and properly and we're making the right decisions. Obviously, at some point, there can be a little bit of a conflict between, okay, this is something we want to just go fully creative with, and this is something that we want to make sure is accurate. But typically speaking, it's always best, I find, to take something that feels, that comes from reality and put it through some form of a lens. So even if we were looking at doing something highly creative, we could always start with something real, or at least researched, and then bend. And that's what we did with a lot of the historical sites where we put the big massive statues into the world. So the big one of Zeus that you meet early on, and there's other ones, the Sisyphus and Titios. We're not making the statement that these things actually existed exactly how we've depicted them, but we always tried to make sure that there was some form of historical note linking to what we've put there. So we found some form of research that said that there was a tribute to Titios in the valley in Phocis there. So where you find that statue that we've crafted and created and we've fictionally created, there is still some form of historical reference to something existing there. And as I said earlier with Medusa, it was most likely a stele or something that somebody had left, but at least there was a slither of something in reality that we've then built upon. We've made something that then becomes a much bigger, more grandiose, more memorable thing for the players that are playing the game, and they remember that and they use those to be able to define, oh yeah, I remember that, so now I know where I am. And those landmarks become super important.
It's really encouraging, as someone who's both a historian and a game dev, it is so encouraging to hear kind of this embedding of the expert as part of it. Because, I always argue that, research is a part of the creative process, just as much as any other part. And I think sometimes it's really wonderful talking to the people, the devs who've worked on these games, because I think sometimes, at least in my personal experience, maybe this is, too narrow, but sometimes I think some devs can be hesitant to use experts, historical or not, because they think that they're just going to be there going, no, that's not accurate. No. When actually I find that it is often the experts who bring the weirdest, the kind of really interesting, all these little tiny details that you wouldn't get reading. So it is always wonderful to hear that working, kind of try and, raise the banner for historians and experts to be embedded in the process.
I totally agree. I think the layer of interest that we managed to create in the world, we would never have got if we were just looking at documentaries and Wikipedia, because it comes from a different level and a different source. And even moving into different franchises after working on AC, I still continue that mantra. We still research and always should do, to make sure that we can create something that feels, I keep saying authentic. It's going to be the word of the day, I think, but that authenticity is definitely something that should come out in any game that we make. And then we build the layer of fiction and fun with that information.
No, really, really brilliant to hear, particularly from a level design and world design perspective, because my background is narrative. So it's really interesting to hear about this kind of blending of artists and level designers is really, really interesting. And so, it sounds like a lot was learnt making this game, but I just wanted to ask, it can be on a kind of either a personal level or learning about the setting, or what you learned just through the development process. What did you learn making this game?
I learned a ton. So I learned not only the things we've already talked about, like all of the actual history of Greece and things. I think for a long time I was probably pretty good at any quiz that had any questions about the Peloponnese. I was there. Some of it's faded since. It's been a little while, but there was a time that there was definitely a lot of information stored in the brain about the history of Greece, and especially the world itself, because that's where I focused my energy and effort. But then really, it takes a village to make a video game. So a lot of it comes down as well to being able to infuse that viewpoint and have other people follow with that same mindset. Similar to, as you've been saying, not everybody always thinks that the best approach is to start with that accuracy and build up. We created a great team for the Odyssey project, and I think the production processes that we had, the mindset of the team, everybody was in it. Everybody wanted to do the best they possibly could to make the best experience and make that Odyssey for the players to adventure on across all disciplines, across everything. So, the stories that we told, like you already mentioned, the gameplay that we let players experience through the world, the big battles that they could partake in, the going out onto the ocean and exploring the ocean, the vast amounts of different wildlife that crops up here and there, seeing a whale come out of the water as you say, and just moments like that made you think, wow, I'm on a journey. All of that coming together really made it for a fabulous experience, creating the game of Odyssey, and then hopefully people feel that when they play it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's been really interesting talking to you, particularly about from this kind of world design perspective, because I think a lot of where we see society and, societal and cultural history, we see it in material objects, we see it in everyday life. And that might not be stuff that comes across in these big, grand narratives we're telling, but just in the actions of an NPC or how a wall looks and things like that. It is those things that we actually see as society's culture. And so I think, really fascinating to hear how much detail you all went into. Very inspiring. And we do end with quickfire questions. I do realize this game, it's been a while since you worked on this game. So quickfire questions. So who is your favorite character in the game?
Barnabas.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I was maybe Phoebe, but Barnabas, I think, yeah.
He's the crazy uncle that, that you kind of want around, even if he's a bit of a troublemaker.
A bit of a troublemaker, but also a heart of gold, and he's got your back. So yeah, I think Barnabas for sure.
Okay, do you have a favorite viewpoint or location in the game?
Oh, the two that come to mind straight away is sitting on top of the Temple of Aphrodite in Corinth or on top of Athena in Athens. I think I'll go for Athena in Athens. Yeah,
incredibly iconic. Do you have a favorite mission in the game?
I think the one that instantly pops as being the memorable one has got to be the Wolf of Sparta. Like the heart, the feeling that you have, the mixture of love and hate in equal measure, and then the fact, without going into too many spoilers for people who haven't played it, the impact of that mission and the fork that it creates at that point, I think is definitely one that I'd go for that one.
Yeah, a lot of emotions, a lot of drama. Yeah. Very good. Do you have a favorite? Now, this is in your remit. You've spoken about details. Do you have a favorite detail? I mean, I love the bees. I love the honey gathering, but do you have a favorite detail?
I think one of them that's a little abstract is the fact that there was an ancient Greek game that kids would play where they were running around with sticks that look like hockey sticks. So I think people thinking that we made the game in Canada where ice hockey is like the hugest sport possible, and we've got these kids running around with hockey sticks, I'm going to go with that. I think that fusion of the hockey stick in ancient Greece just being like, what, really? And it being genuine.
That's great. I love that so much. And do you think there's something that players might miss when playing that you think they should find or pay attention to?
I think my answer to that's going to be, I hope so. Because I think that's the point. I think players hopefully will be distracted by different things. And that's all part of the journey. It's all part of being on an Odyssey, is you find things that attract your attention and you go and do those things. And you do it so you might miss something else, but hopefully you're going to spend such an amount of time enjoying the game, playing the game, that eventually you'll come across them and you won't feel that sensation of missing out. So I'm going to dodge that question by saying, I hope they do. And I hope eventually they find them all, because I think that's part of the journey.
Well, I know I'm definitely going to go back and look out for those hockey sticks. Well, thank you so much, Benjamin, for speaking to this. That was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you for having me. It's been great. It's been great to reminisce and think about some of the stuff we did back on Odyssey.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching Echoes of History. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the real history behind the Assassin's Creed games, then subscribe for more episodes. You can check out the extended interviews wherever you get your podcasts by clicking the link in the description. You should also hit the links that are floating on the screen somewhere. Are they on my face? They're on my face again, aren't they? Get them off. Follow a link, please.